August 7th, 1943, over the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Richard Bong, 23, flying a battered P-38 Lightning, faced a problem nobody had solved: how to escape a Zero glued to his tail. In 10 seconds, he made a move so reckless it defied every flight manual. What he did next would rewrite the rules of aerial combat and help turn the tide of the Pacific War. The P-38 Lightning shuddered as cannon fire ripped into its left engine cowling. Richard Bong's hands gripped the control stick so tightly his knuckles went white, but it did nothing to calm the rattling metal under his boots. At 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, the sky was a searing sheet of August sunlight, blue and brilliant, almost peaceful, until you saw the streak of black smoke trailing from what had been his wingman's plane. His wingman was gone, just like that. Hit, spiraling, disappearing into the Pacific Ocean without so much as a final word over the radio. Bong hadn't even seen it happen. Just a flash, then silence. Now he was alone, and the Japanese Zero on his tail was still there, dancing through the sky like it was made of paper and smoke. It had matched his every turn, every twist, every desperate roll. The Zero didn't chase him, it toyed with him. Each time he pulled away, it stayed close. Each time he tried to maneuver, the Zero answered like it had read the same playbook. Maybe it had. Bong had been through the best training the Army Air Forces had to offer. He'd learned every maneuver that could save a pilot's life. Barrel rolls, chandelle, lag rolls, split S, defensive spirals. He had tried them all in the last 90 seconds. None had worked. And now the Zero was only 200 yards behind, close enough to see the shape of its wings, close enough to die. The cockpit was a riot of alarms. His left engine was losing oil pressure fast. The
We crossed
Lightning's
the target
twin
at
boom
0800,
frame
then follow this
groaned as he
vector
tried to
south.
bank
The
again,
weather looks clear, but watch
but
for
the
the
damaged
zeros near the
engine
ridge.
dragged like
All right,
an
let's
anchor.
get to it.
He could feel it, speed bleeding away, altitude dropping like a stone. The P-38 was fighting gravity, damage, and the laws of physics all at once. It was a fight he was losing. He could hear the Zero's guns, even over the roar of his own engines. A quick burst, like a warning. The next one wouldn't miss. This was it. No backup, no miracle. And then Richard Bong did something nobody had taught him, something no manual suggested, something that was supposed to get a pilot killed. He rolled the P-38 completely inverted. The nose of the Lightning dropped like a hammer toward the ocean, and Bong shoved the stick forward hard. The sky disappeared beneath him. Now he wasn't just diving. He was falling. Upside down. The sun flipped. The ocean rushed up. The world turned inside out. Negative G's slammed into his body. Blood surged into his skull, filled his eyes, blurred the instrument panel into a haze of crimson. The oxygen mask pulled hard against his face. Loose shell casings and a forgotten wrench floated from the cockpit floor and slammed into the canopy above his head. The plane screamed, its twin Allison engines shrieking in protest as airspeed surged past the red line. For 2 full seconds, he was blind. Not just from the blood, from the speed, from the raw force of doing something no pilot was meant to do. And when he finally rolled level again at 12,000 feet, somehow alive, somehow still conscious, the sky behind him was empty. Gone. The Zero had vanished. Bong kept circling, one slow spiral, scanning all directions. Nothing. Not a silhouette, not a shadow, not a trace of his enemy. Just the whine of his damaged engine and the thunder still pounding in his chest. He didn't understand what had just happened. He only knew this. He was supposed to be dead. What Bong couldn't know in that moment, blood drying in the corners of his eyes, hands still trembling over the throttle, was that he had just stumbled into something that would change the Pacific War. A maneuver not born from theory or planning but desperation, not taught in flight school, but passed in whispers between the lucky few who lived long enough to learn it. If you're sitting there now, listening, you might ask, how could turning your plane upside down and diving possibly be the answer? Wouldn't that make you an easier target? Wouldn't it just speed up the inevitable? But that's only if you assume the zero could follow. That's only if you believed, as every American pilot had believed, that the zero was invincible. Richard Bong had just found its blind spot. In that terrifying inverted plummet, physics had betrayed the zero, and Bong had lived. It wasn't courage, it wasn't strategy, it was instinct, raw, gut-level do-or-die instinct. But instincts, when they're right, tend to repeat themselves. Back at base, Bong didn't tell the story with bravado. There was no swagger in his voice when the crew chief asked what the hell had happened to the oil pressure light. No big speech over drinks that night in the mess tent. Just a quiet explanation like he was still trying to convince himself it had worked. I rolled inverted, he said, pushed into a dive, thought it was over. And then he shook his head, like maybe it still was. Nobody laughed. Nobody rolled their eyes. Because deep down, every man in that room had seen the zero up close. They knew what it meant to be locked in its sights. They knew what it was like to pull every maneuver in
We
the
cross
book,
the target at
still
0800,
feel
then
the
follow
bullets
this vector south.
Maybe,
The weather looks clear, but watch for
maybe
the
there was
zeros
something
near the
to
ridge.
this.
All right, let's get to it.
The next time Bong flew, he flew differently. He didn't just wait for the zero to come. He started thinking about how to make it chase him. Before Richard Bong rolled his P-38 inverted and dove toward the sea, before any American pilot discovered how to outmaneuver the Japanese zero, there was only one unspoken truth in the Pacific. You didn't beat a zero. You survived it, if you were lucky. Ask any American pilot flying over the Philippines in December 1941, or over the jungles of New Guinea in early 42, and you'd hear the same story. Tight formation, calm radio chatter, then chaos, explosions, screams, and suddenly, the sky full of those thin-winged, pale gray ghosts, zeros, appearing from nowhere and vanishing just as fast. It wasn't just their speed, or their turn rate, or their uncanny ability to show up right where you didn't want them. It was all of it together. A zero in the sky was like a knife in the dark, lethal, precise, and nearly impossible to see coming until it was already too late. The Mitsubishi A6M0 wasn't just a plane. It was an idea, a myth.
We cross
A
the target
whispered
at
fear
0800,
passed
then
between
follow this
pilots
vector
in
south.
dimly lit
The
tents,
weather looks clear, but
and
watch
over
for the
mess
zeros
hall
near the
coffee.
ridge.
All right, let's get
The
to
ones
it.
who hadn't flown against it yet didn't believe the stories. The ones who didn't want to talk about it. In the spring of 1942, American intelligence analysts were still scrambling to understand what they were up against. The reports made no sense. A Japanese fighter that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange every aircraft the U.S. had? That was impossible. But it wasn't. The Zero could do a full 360-degree turn at combat speed in just under 16 seconds. Compare that to the 23 seconds needed by a P-40 Warhawk, or even longer for a P-39 Cobra. In a dogfight, 7 seconds was an eternity. 7 seconds meant the difference between being the hunter and becoming debris. It wasn't just about the turn. The Zero could climb like a homesick angel. Powered by its 950 horsepower Sakai engine, it had a phenomenal range, over 1,600 miles, thanks to its lightweight and massive fuel capacity. American fighters at the time were lucky to manage half that. But that range came with a cost. To achieve such agility, Japanese engineers had sacrificed everything that made American planes survivable. There was no armor behind the pilot's seat, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The airframe was paper-thin in places, designed only for speed and maneuverability. It was a thoroughbred, fast, responsive, and fragile. But in early 1942, American pilots didn't know any of that. All they knew was that when a Zero appeared, someone usually died. In one of the first brutal engagements over the Coral Sea, Lieutenant Paul Franklin, flying a P-39, described the Zero's attack like a ghostly blur. "I never saw it coming," he wrote in a letter that somehow made it home. "He was just there, on my six. I pulled into a hard turn, maxed out the stick, but he followed like he was reading my mind. I could feel his bullets stitching through the fuselage before I even knew what was happening." Franklin crash-landed in a mangrove swamp and spent 3 days crawling through the mud before rescue. Most weren't so lucky. The kill ratios were horrifying. Over the Philippines, for every 3 Japanese aircraft shot down, 9 American fighters were lost. On Wake Island, the U.S. Marine pilots found themselves outflown and outgunned almost immediately. In the Dutch East Indies, even experienced pilots with World War I dogfighting instincts were shredded. American tactics at the time were optimistic. Pilots had been trained in the old school style: get behind your enemy, turn with him, force a mistake, line up the shot. It was what had worked in Europe during the First World War, where clumsy biplanes stumbled through the sky like boxers in slow motion. But the Pacific wasn't Europe, and the Zero wasn't a Fokker triplane. If you tried to turn with a Zero, you were dead, period. It wasn't long before commanders realized they had no choice but to adapt, or keep sending young men to die. Pilots began trading knowledge the way soldiers pass along stories of close calls. If you saw a Zero coming from above, your best bet was to dive and pray it didn't follow. If it got behind you, don't even try to turn, just run. And yet, even with these hard-earned lessons, the fear remained. Pilots didn't just fear dying, they feared being outflown, outclassed, humiliated in the most terrifying way, by a ghost that knew your every move and punished every mistake. There was something almost personal about how the Zero killed. It didn't overpower you with sheer force. It lured you into a fight you couldn't win, and then made you feel every second of the loss. You might wonder, how did something so light, so fragile, dominate the skies? The answer lies in the Japanese design philosophy of the time: kill before being killed, hit hard, hit fast, and don't get hit at all. Don't. That philosophy worked, until American pilots figured out a way to flip the script. But in 1942, that revelation hadn't come yet. Not for Thatch, not for Bong, not for anyone. Back then, all they had were warning labels and body bags. Flight briefings started including phrases like, "Avoid prolonged engagement with Zero fighters." Maps were marked with known Zero patrol areas, not to attack, but to evade. Some pilots developed routines: lucky charms, ritual prayers, even wearing the same socks, just to feel like they had some control. Because control was the one thing the Zero took away. It dictated the fight, chose when to engage, when to leave, climbed when you chased, turned when you pressed. Like it wasn't bound by the same rules of air combat. Like it wasn't
We
even
cross the
human.
target at 0800, then follow
And
this
yet,
vector south.
in that
Weather looks
illusion
clear, but watch for the
lay the
Zeros near the
seed
ridge.
of its downfall.
All right, let's get to it.
Because no matter how supernatural it seemed, the Zero still obeyed physics, still depended on design, still had a beating engine, a fuel line, a pilot who bled. But in the early months of the Pacific War, those truths were buried beneath the myth. To the men who fought it, the Zero was a ghost in the sky. And ghosts don't lose dogfights. Not yet. The Zero could fly circles around nearly every American fighter in the Pacific, but it couldn't fly through physics. For all the mystique that surrounded the Mitsubishi A6M0 in the early days of the war, for all the legends whispered by pilots in the mess halls and briefing tents, there was one undeniable truth hiding beneath the myth. It was not a miracle. It was a machine. And every machine has limits. At first glance, the Zero seemed invincible. It could turn tighter, climb faster, and fly farther than anything the Americans had. It slipped through the sky like a blade of wind, slicing into enemy formations and leaving smoke trails where fighters used to be. But what American pilots hadn't seen, what they hadn't yet understood, was the price the Zero paid to be that nimble. To build an aircraft that could turn so tightly and accelerate so quickly, Japanese engineers had made a decision, a radical one. They had stripped the Zero of nearly every safety measure that made American planes survivable. There was no armor plating behind the pilot's seat, no reinforced bulkheads, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no armor for the engine. Even the aluminum skin was paper thin, barely thick enough to hold its shape under the pressure of flight. In fact, the entire plane weighed just 3,700 pounds empty. That was nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than a P-40 Warhawk. On the ground, that might not mean much, but in the sky, weight is everything. Less weight means faster turns, longer range, and quicker climbs. But it also means fragility. The kind of fragility that becomes fatal when the fight doesn't go according to plan. And there was another weakness, one hidden deep within the Zero's design, buried beneath its gleaming surface and impressive kill ratios. Its engine, specifically the way it handled fuel. The Zero's engine used a carburetor system which, at the time, was standard for many aircraft. In level flight and even moderate turns, it worked well. But under negative G-forces, like those generated when a plane dove sharply while inverted, carburetors had a fatal flaw. Fuel stopped flowing properly. The engine would sputter. Sometimes it would quit entirely. That meant the Zero could turn, it could climb, it could roll, but it couldn't dive upside down. Not at speed, not without risking a flameout in the middle of combat. American pilots didn't know this at first. Not even the engineers back home fully understood, but some of them started to suspect. They noticed that Zeros rarely followed them into steep dives, especially those initiated while inverted. At first, it seemed like luck. Then it became a pattern. Eventually, it became a tactic. By contrast, the P-38 Lightning, along with newer models of the P-47 Thunderbolt and F-4U Corsair, was equipped with a fuel-injected engine. Instead of relying on gravity and pressure to deliver fuel through a carburetor, fuel injection systems could maintain consistent flow under extreme conditions, including negative G maneuvers. That one difference changed everything. When a P-38 rolled inverted and pushed into a
We crossed the
dive,
target at
its
0800, then
engines
follow
didn't
this vector
hesitate.
south.
The weather
They
looks clear,
screamed.
but watch for the Zeros near the ridge.
The aircraft
All right, let's
responded
get to it.
instantly, plunging toward the sea with increasing speed, while the Zero above began to hesitate, then wobble, then stall. Think about that for a moment. A dogfight isn't won by maneuvering alone. It's won by energy, by who has more speed, more altitude, more options. And if one fighter could dive full speed from 20,000 feet without its engine quitting, while the other had to hold back or risk disaster, well, that was no longer a fair fight. The sky was the same. The laws of gravity were the same. But one machine could use them better. And there was more. While the Zero had sacrificed armor and structure for agility, the P-38 was built like a tank with wings. Its twin-boom design gave it incredible stability in dives. Its cockpit was protected. Its airframe was reinforced. It could take hits and keep flying, something the Zero almost never did. It's hard to overstate how important that difference was. In combat, pilots don't always make perfect decisions. They take fire. They make mistakes. Sometimes they have to fly
We
through
crossed the
bullets
target
to
at
get home.
0800, then follow this
In
vector
a
south.
Zero,
The weather
a
looks clear, but
single
watch for the
well-placed
Zeros near the
round
ridge.
could
All
set
right,
the
let's get to
fuel
it.
tanks ablaze. In a P-38, you might lose a system, maybe an engine, but you could survive. And then there was the matter of G-forces. When an aircraft pulls up into a steep climb or banks sharply into a tight turn, the pilot experiences positive G's, forces that press the body down into the seat. With training and muscle control, pilots could endure up to 6 or even 8 Gs for short bursts. But when a pilot dives while inverted, like Bong did, that creates negative Gs. Instead of being pushed into the seat, blood rushes upward, into the head, flooding the eyes and brain. Even 2 or 3 negative Gs can cause blurred vision, nosebleeds, or unconsciousness. Human bodies aren't made for that, and neither are most planes. But American fighters, especially the P-38, were engineered to handle the strain. The airframes were stress-tested. The engines were mounted to survive shifts in orientation. And with fuel injection keeping everything running, the plane could keep going even when the pilot was seeing stars. You might ask, why didn't the Japanese fix this? They tried. Late-war Japanese designs like the Ki-84 and the J-2M Raiden featured stronger construction and better power plants. Some even used captured American technology to redesign their fuel system, but by then it was too late. The tide had turned. The Americans had learned how to fly smarter. They weren't fighting the Zero on its terms anymore. They had found its limits. And once you know a machine's limits, you know how to beat it. The Zero wasn't a ghost. It wasn't magic. It was just a machine. And every machine, no matter how fast or elegant, breaks when pushed too far. Thomas Lynch was not the kind of man who chased legends. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he certainly didn't believe in invincible enemies. He believed in discipline, repetition, and instincts honed through exhaustion. By April of 1943, Lynch had flown nearly every day since Pearl Harbor. He was a combat veteran before most pilots in his squadron had ever seen enemy fire. At 28, he was already considered old fighter pilots, a grizzled survivor in the sky filled with greenhorns. And he had watched too many of those greenhorns die. That morning, over the Russell Islands, Lynch didn't expect anything unusual. His squadron, the 39th Fighter Squadron flying P-38 Lightnings, was tasked with patrol and support. Another day of flying cover, watching the skies, staying alert. But war never respects routine. The Japanese came from above, diving in formation out of the blinding sun. 8 Zeros, silent and fast, dropped like knives into the American flight. The first pass shattered formation. Radio chatter turned to chaos. And within seconds, Lynch realized something that would chill any pilot's blood. He was alone. The rest of his squadron had scattered. 2 were hit immediately, spiraling smoke toward the jungle below. A third vanished behind a cloud bank, chased by 2 enemy fighters. And then, Lynch felt the sting of tracers, green lines snapping past his cockpit canopy. A Zero had found him. Maybe 2. His first move was instinct. Brake turn, hard left, nose up, throttle maxed. The P-38 responded with a groan, but the Zero matched him perfectly. In his rearview mirror, he saw the enemy fighter cling to his tail like a shadow. He tried again. Barrel roll, shallow dive, climb. Nothing worked. The Zero followed like it was reading his thoughts. At 20,000 feet, he was running out of options, running out of sky. Lynch knew his P-38 was faster in a dive. He had used that speed before to escape, but this time he remembered something. Something subtle, something strange. In a previous skirmish weeks earlier, he had rolled inverted during a disorienting climb, almost blacked out, and accidentally slipped into a steep dive. The Zero behind him hadn't followed. At the time, he chalked it up to luck. But was it? Now, with the enemy locked on his 6, Lynch made a decision. Not instinct, not panic. A decision. He rolled the P-38 inverted and shoved the stick forward. The Lightning tipped over and dove toward the Pacific Ocean. Nose first, belly to the sky, the horizon flipping upside down. For an instant, Lynch was falling. Gravity tore at him. Blood surged into his skull. His vision dimmed. The cockpit turned red. Shell casings and loose debris floated up and bounced against the canopy like ghosts of earlier fights.
We cross the target at
His
0800,
oxygen
then follow
mask
this
pulled
vector
away
south.
from his face.
The weather looks
The
clear, but
straps
watch for the
digging
zeros
into
near the
his
ridge.
skin as if
All
trying
right,
to
let's
escape.
get to it.
His legs lifted from the seat. He wasn't sitting anymore. He was suspended, body pressed upward by invisible hands. He had never felt anything like it. The altimeter spun like a roulette wheel. And then, like cutting through a veil, he saw it. Clear blue below. No smoke, no bullets, no zero. Gone. He leveled out at 12,000 feet, engines roaring, lungs burning. He turned sharply, scanning the sky behind him. Nothing. The zeros that had hunted him only seconds earlier were nowhere to be seen. But Lynch wasn't finished. Not this time. He pulled the throttle back, rolled into a climbing arc, and looped around to regain altitude. His aircraft surged upward, the P-38's twin engines thundering with the momentum of the dive. The tables had turned. Now he was above. And the hunter. He spotted one of the zeros below him, weaving slowly, clearly searching. The pilot had lost track of his prey. Lynch dropped in from above, silent and unseen, his .50 caliber guns finding their mark in a single perfect burst. The zero disintegrated in midair. Another appeared, trailing smoke, struggling to regain control. Lynch turned and fired again. 2 kills in a minute. When he landed back at base, the crew chief stared at him like he was a ghost himself. Lynch's face was a mess of broken capillaries. Tiny red dots peppered across his cheeks and forehead. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed and red. His flight suit was damp with sweat. His oxygen mask streaked with blood. He didn't speak for several minutes. Just sat on the edge of the wing, breathing slowly, his boots touching the scorched tarmac, like he needed to remember the ground was still there. That night, after he'd showered and cleaned up, Lynch sat with his squadron in the canvas mess tent. Someone handed him a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. He didn't touch it. Instead, he looked around the room at the faces of young men, some of whom would not be alive this time next week. And then, he told them what had happened. "I rolled inverted," he said, "and pushed into the dive. That was all. No bravado. No dramatic pauses. Just the truth." The others leaned in. "They didn't follow?" one asked. "No," Lynch replied quietly. "They couldn't." There was a long silence. Someone whistled, low and soft. It was the kind of moment that doesn't go into official reports. No commanding officer wrote it down. No manual was updated. But in that tent, among those men, something shifted. The zero had limits, and one man had found them. It didn't start with orders. There were no briefings, no chalkboards, no instructors with pointers explaining diagrams. The new tactic, the one that would change everything, spread the way survival always spreads in war, in whispers, in late-night conversations, in the kinds of quiet, cautious exchanges that only happen between men who have looked death in the eyes and lived long enough to tell someone else how not to die. By the summer of 1943, across the airfields of the South Pacific, from Guadalcanal to New Georgia to Bougainville, something had begun to shift. Pilots who had flown with Thomas Lynch, or who knew someone who had, began mentioning it. Not loudly, not formally, just a nudge, a warning. If a zero gets on your tail, they'd say, don't turn. Roll inverted. Dive. It sounded insane the first time a young pilot heard it. Roll inverted? Dive straight down? Every flight instructor back home had warned against that. It was dangerous, disorienting, a guaranteed way to black out, or worse.
We cross the target at
But the men
0800,
saying it
then
weren't
follow this vector
instructors.
south.
They
The
were
weather looks
survivors.
clear, but watch for the zeros near the
And
ridge.
survivors have a
All right,
certain
let's get to it.
authority. In the 5th Fighter Command tent on a humid morning in July, A green lieutenant, fresh out of flight school, leaned over his plate of powdered eggs and asked the older captain beside him, "What do I do if one of them gets behind me?" The captain didn't look up. He just stirred the instant coffee in his tin cup. "You dive," he said. "Yeah, but what kind of dive?" The captain looked at him then, eyes tired, hands scarred. "An ugly one," he said. "Flip her upside down and push." The lieutenant frowned. "That'll red me out." Better red than dead. And that was the lesson. There were no official memos, no updates to the training manuals. The U.S. Army Air Forces hadn't caught up yet. But word moved faster than paperwork, and the word was spreading. Across the runways and repair tents, among the ground crews and flight engineers, a new phrase started to circulate, going upside down on them. It was part joke, part ritual, part silent prayer. But underneath it all was a growing belief. The zero could be beaten. The story of Thomas Lynch made the rounds, though it changed a little each time. Some said he'd pulled so many negative G's his helmet flew
We
off.
crossed the target at 0800, then
Others
follow
swore
this
his engine
vector
was
south.
sputtering
The
when he
weather
pulled
looks
out
clear,
of the
but watch for
dive,
the zeros near the
barely
ridge.
holding together.
All right, let's get to it.
Everyone agreed on one thing. The zeros hadn't followed him. They couldn't. Other pilots began trying it, cautiously at first, usually only when everything else had failed. But each time it worked, the confidence grew. And with it, a new kind of defiance, an edge of confidence that hadn't existed just months earlier. Captain Robert D. Haven, flying escort over New Georgia, rolled inverted and dove when a zero latched onto his 6. In his mirror, he saw the enemy fighter try to follow, only to stall, falter, and vanish. When he leveled out, the sky was his again. He returned to base and told every man who would listen, "Don't wait. The second you see him coming, flip and dive. Let physics do the work." Pilots began including it in their mission prep chatter. Not in front of the COs, of course, not in the official plans. But just before taxiing out, while strapping in or adjusting their goggles, remember, if he gets behind you, yeah, I know, go upside down. In the pilot tents, on long nights between missions, the conversation became a ritual, a kind of informal training, a way to pass on what the manuals hadn't taught. They spoke in half sentences, using the shorthand of people who understood the stakes. You ever do it? Yeah, over a ball. He didn't follow. Still get the headaches? 3 days, worth it. Flight surgeons started to notice the signs. Burst capillaries on the face, bloodshot eyes, complaints of vision fuzz, migraines, even momentary blackouts. But they didn't tell the men to stop. How could they? Because along with the symptoms came something else. Fewer body bags, fewer lost flights, more men coming back. And in a war where survival was sometimes measured in hours, that meant everything. Of course, not everyone believed it. Some of the older pilots, especially those who hadn't yet seen the maneuver work, were skeptical. One major, a veteran of the early Philippines campaign, snorted when he heard a younger pilot describe it. "You telling me you dive upside down on purpose?" The kid nodded. "Hell yeah. Zeros hate it." The major shook his head. "I've seen men die trying that." The kid shrugged. "I've seen men die not trying it." It wasn't a revolution announced with fanfare. It was a quiet shift, a tilt in the axis of thinking. And like most battlefield innovations, it didn't start in a classroom. It started in a cockpit, under fire, with seconds to live and no options left. And it was passed from mouth to mouth, tent to tent, like folklore written in engine smoke. Maybe that's why it stuck. Because it wasn't about pride. It wasn't about doctrine. It was about staying alive. And so the phrase became a kind of totem, a mantra spoken between brothers before heading into the sky. If he gets on your tail, don't turn. Go upside down. Dive. By late 1943, What had begun as a desperate gamble was becoming something else entirely. It was no longer just a trick whispered between tents or murmured in cockpits before takeoff. The inverted dive, rolling upside down and plunging away from the fight, was earning a new name on the lips of squadron leaders. Tactic, not superstition, not luck, not some reckless last resort, but a deliberate, practiced move. A way to flip the fight and stay alive. It didn't happen overnight. No memo came down from headquarters. No general signed off on a revised manual. The United States Army Air Forces still officially frowned upon inverted maneuvers and high-risk dives. The paperwork hadn't caught up with reality. But the men on the flight lines had. Colonel Neil Kirby of the 475th Fighter Group had seen too many good pilots die trying to turn with zeros. Young men with sharp reflexes and clean uniforms who didn't yet understand what they were up against. So, during his mission briefings, Kirby began saying the thing that nobody else had the nerve to say out loud. If you try to turn with a zero, you die. He said it plainly, without apology, without drama. Then, he'd lean over the map, tap a point with his finger and say, if they're here and you spot one behind you, don't wait. Don't move. Roll over and dive. Use your speed. Come back around from above, and when you shoot, don't miss. The men in his command listened. Because Kirby wasn't quoting theory, he was speaking from the front lines. And pilots respected that. They didn't need pages of data or charts of G-force
We cross the target at
tolerances.
0800, then
They
follow
needed
this
to know
vector
what
south.
worked.
The weather looks
The numbers
clear, but
spoke for
watch for the
themselves.
zeros near the ridge.
Before
right,
the
let's get to
tactic became widespread, kill ratios in the Pacific had been brutal. Some units lost 3 or 4 aircraft for every Japanese plane destroyed. Zeros ruled the skies with their superior turning ability and precision strikes. But after the inverted dive began spreading, the math flipped. Suddenly, American squadrons were coming home with fewer holes in their wings and more enemy kills scratched into the fuselage. For every American plane shot down, 3 or 4 zeros were falling. The shift wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Pilots were no longer flying with fear tightening around their throats. They had an option now, a way to respond, a move they could trust. That mattered. It mattered more than anything. Captain Thomas McGuire, one of the sharpest pilots in the Pacific, and eventually the second highest scoring American ace of the war, made the inverted dive his signature. On multiple occasions, he used the maneuver to escape tailing zeros, only to climb back and destroy them moments later from above. In one infamous engagement over Lady Gulf in 1944, McGuire deliberately slowed his P-38 just enough to tempt a Japanese pilot into taking the bait. The zero fell in behind him, closing fast. McGuire waited until the last second, then roll, dive, disappear. The zero tried to follow. It couldn't. Its airframe collapsed under the negative G-stress, ripping itself apart mid-air. McGuire didn't need to fire a single bullet. That's when commanders began to understand what they were really seeing. The inverted dive wasn't just a way to escape. It was a test, a filter, a maneuver that separated the durable from the fragile, the engineered from the elegant. And in that test, American fighters, especially the P-38, held the upper hand. Other aircraft adapted the tactic too. The F-4U Corsair, with its massive radial engine and gull wings, could perform inverted dives even more violently. Marine Corps pilots flying from Henderson Field used the technique to full effect. Their aircraft screamed through the air like falling anvils. Unfollowable, uncatchable, unstoppable. The P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug for its bulk, was even more terrifying in a dive. With its incredible weight and durable frame, it plunged toward the Earth at speeds that bordered on supersonic. Zeros simply couldn't keep up. American pilots began structuring entire engagements around this advantage. They would bait Zeros into pursuing them, then roll inverted and dive away, knowing the enemy couldn't follow. Once they had separation, they'd climb back up, regain altitude, and return with speed and surprise on their side. It was no longer just defense. It was a trap. And Japanese pilots began to realize it. They started hesitating. They stopped committing fully to tail chases. Some squadrons were even instructed to avoid diving engagements with American fighters altogether, because what had once been an obvious kill was now a potential death sentence. The Americans had rewritten the rules of engagement, and they hadn't done it from a command center. They'd done it from cockpits. That's the strange thing about doctrine in war. It rarely starts with generals. It starts with one man, one desperate move, one success, and then another, until the move becomes a habit. Then, a habit becomes a rule. And before anyone officially approves it, the war has already changed. That's what happened with the inverted dive.
We cross the target at
What
0800,
began
then follow
as
this
panic
vector south.
became process.
The weather looks clear, but watch for
What
the zeros
began
near
as
the ridge.
survival became
All right, let's get to it.
strategy. By the time the manuals caught up, by the time new pilots began seeing the maneuver diagrammed in classrooms and lectures, it was already old news. The veterans had known for months. They had learned it the hard way. Up there under fire with no one to save them but themselves. The sky was calm at first, blue and empty. So empty it almost felt like peace. Captain Jack Turner knew better. He scanned the horizon from the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, sweat gathering beneath his oxygen mask. The late afternoon sun hung low, glaring off the Pacific, casting long shadows across the clouds. He was flying escort today. A squadron of B-25 bombers lumbered ahead, steady as freight trains, engines droning. His job, keep them alive. At 18,000 feet, visibility was good. Too good. That's what worried him. The radio crackled, then a voice. Bogies, 11 o'clock, high. Turner's eyes snapped upward. 4 dark specks descending fast. No contrails, no wing tanks, no hesitation. Zeros. He keyed the mic. Tally, 4 incoming. Break and engage. The bomber formation scattered slightly. Defensive gunners swinging
We
into
cross the
action.
target at 0800,
Turner
then
pulled
follow this
hard
vector
right.
south.
The weather
Throttled
looks
forward
clear,
and
but
began to
watch for the
climb,
zeros near the ridge.
meeting the
All
attack
right, let's
head
get to
on.
it.
It was suicide to wait for them to come to you. The sky turned into a blur of motion. Fighters twisting, tracers slicing, engines screaming. Turner banked, dodged a burst, caught 1-0 in his sights, fired, missed. Then he felt it, an eerie presence behind him. He looked into the mirror mounted atop the canopy. There it was, slick, silver gray, shark-nosed. A 0, close on his tail, matching every move like it had rehearsed this chase 1,000 times. Turner rolled left. The 0 followed, pulled into a climb, still there, too close, too fast. His heart pounded. He was losing altitude and energy with every evasive move, and the 0 wasn't flinching. He knew what came next. That clean, tight burst of fire that would punch through aluminum and flesh. Turner had seconds, and a choice. His hand hovered over the throttle. Then he remembered the briefing, not from the flight manual, from the tent the night before. If one gets behind you, roll inverted. Dive. He rolled. The sky flipped. The world went sideways. For an instant, the horizon became meaningless. There was no up, no down, just sky and ocean, and that awful roar of airflow over the canopy. Then he shoved his stick forward. The P-38 tipped nose down and plunged, belly to the sun, cockpit to the sea. Negative G's hit him like a fist. His body lifted from the seat, oxygen mask pulling taut. The blood surged into his head. He felt it pressing behind his eyes, turning vision red at the edges. The altimeter spun downward. The air screamed louder than any engine. Inverted. Falling. Blind. but alive. He gritted his teeth, held the dive, counted 1, 2, 3 seconds. Then he leveled out at 12,000 feet, breathing hard, blinking through the haze. Silence. He looked back. The Zero was gone, just gone. Turner smiled, not because he was safe, because now he knew. He throttled up, pulled the stick back, and climbed hard, the lightning roaring as it surged skyward with new momentum. His head pounded, his eyes stung, but his vision cleared, and his altitude returned. At 16,000 feet, he saw it. A single zero, turning wide, slow. The pilot was searching, unaware. Perfect. Turner rolled, lined up his sights, and dove. This time he was in control. He fired. A burst of .50 caliber tore through the Zero's fuselage. The plane spasmed, wobbled, then burst into flames before vanishing into the clouds below. No joy, no celebration, just the job. He circled once, checking for other threats, but the air was clear. The bombers continued on course. The sky belonged to them again. He flew back in silence, hands still tight on the controls. Sweat rolled down his spine. His mask tasted like copper. When he landed, the ground crew rushed out, eyes scanning for damage. They found none. Turner climbed out slowly, took off his helmet, pulled off the oxygen mask. His face was red with broken vessels, his eyes bloodshot. A familiar look now. The crew chief stepped forward. "How'd you shake him?" Turner didn't answer right away. He reached for a canteen, took a long drink. Then he looked the man in the eye. "I didn't shake him," he said. "I let him follow me." The chief blinked. "Say again?" "That was his mistake," Turner said quietly. "He followed me." There was a moment of silence. Then the crew chief grinned slow and wide. "You went upside down on him." Turner nodded. The whisper had become a war cry. That night in the dim light of the tent, Turner told the story. He didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize, just laid it out. What he felt, what he did, what he saw when he came out of the dive. The other pilots leaned in, listening closely. It wasn't about glory. It was about understanding, about staying alive. They absorbed every word like it was gospel. Because out there, over the open Pacific, every second counted. Every edge mattered. And this edge, this one worked. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai had flown more than 200 missions. By the time he first saw an American fighter do something that didn't make sense, it was the spring of 1943. And for Sakai, Japan's most respected living ace, the sky still felt like home. He knew how to read it, how to move through it like it was water, and he was born with wings. He had made a name for himself in the Philippines, over Java, over Guadalcanal.
We cross the target
His
at
kills were
0800, then
legendary.
follow this vector south.
His instincts,
The weather looks clear, but
razor
watch
sharp.
for the Zeros near the ridge.
But that
All right, let's
day,
get to it.
something changed. He was behind a P-38 Lightning, close and steady. The American pilot didn't see him, at least not yet. Sakai had closed the distance carefully, using the sun behind him, dropping from above with the silence of a falling leaf. He could see the twin booms of the lightning shining beneath him. The kill was seconds away. Then, without warning, the P-38 rolled inverted. Sakai blinked. The move wasn't a barrel roll. It wasn't evasive. It was deliberate. And then it dove, hard, straight down. But not the kind of dive Sakai expected. The American fighter didn't nose down gently or peel away into a curve. It fell, violently, inverted, like it had been yanked by some invisible force. The maneuver made no tactical sense, and yet the effect was immediate. Sakai followed instinctively, but as he rolled inverted to give chase, something went wrong. The Zero's controls turned soft. His engine sputtered. The nose bobbled like it was caught in a gust. His vision blurred, not from G-forces, but from disbelief. The American plane vanished beneath him, plummeting through the sky, while Sakai's own aircraft began to choke. He leveled out, regained control. But the P-38 was gone. Not damaged, not hit. Just gone. At the time, Sakai chalked it up to a one-off, an accident. Maybe the American pilot had panicked. Maybe he blacked out. Maybe the dive had killed him. But then it happened again, and again. Over the next few months, Japanese pilots began reporting something strange. American fighters weren't playing by the rules anymore. They weren't trying to turn, weren't getting caught in the same tight spirals where Zeros had always won. They were doing something else. They were diving. And not just diving, they were vanishing. One pilot described it as chasing a stone dropped from a tower. Another said, it was like trying to catch smoke. Sakai began to hear stories from younger pilots. Their voices shaky, confused. They would line up a clean shot, watch the enemy roll inverted and disappear. And then, minutes later, they'd be the ones getting hit. From above, from behind. The hunter had become the prey. For Japanese aviators trained in an aerial doctrine that prized maneuverability above all else, it was disorienting. Every hour they spent in the cockpit had drilled the same truth into their bones. Outturn your enemy, and you win. But now, the Americans weren't turning. They were using energy, altitude, speed, gravity, to change the terms of the fight. The Zero, for all its elegance and agility, had one major flaw. It couldn't sustain negative G dives. Its carbureted engine sputtered. Its airframe couldn't handle the stress. And its pilots, many barely out of training, lacked the experience to adjust. Meanwhile, the Americans were learning, quickly. Veterans like Bong, McGuire, Lynch, and Haven were racking up kills. Not by flying prettier, but by flying smarter. By forcing Zeros into positions they couldn't escape. By diving away, regaining altitude, and returning as fast falling swords from the sky. Japanese command began to take notice. Briefings changed. Instructions shifted. Pilots were warned not to follow American fighters into steep dives. Some ignored the advice and paid the price. Others obeyed.
We cross the target
But
at
that created
0800, then
another
follow this
problem.
vector south.
The weather looks
Hesitation.
clear, but watch for the Zeros near the
Once,
ridge.
All right,
the
let's
Zero
get to it.
pilot would press an attack without fear. Now he had to calculate. Can I follow? Will my engine hold? What if he's baiting me? And in dogfighting, hesitation kills. Sakai himself would later write about this shift in mindset. We had trained to pursue relentlessly, he said, to press every advantage. But now, we were being forced to think twice. That alone changed everything. The Americans had found their opening, and they drove it deeper with every engagement. You could feel it in the skies, the balance tipping. The air no longer belonged to the Zero. It belonged to whoever understood its limits and exploited them. The worst part? The Zeros hadn't gotten worse. The Americans had simply gotten better. They adapted. They learned. They took desperation and turned it into doctrine. And the Japanese? They clung to a myth. The myth of the invincible Zero. But myths don't win wars. Machines do. Tactics do. Adaptation does. By early 1944, Sakai flew differently, cautiously. He still had the instincts, the
We
skill,
cross the target at
but
0800, then
something
follow
had
this
changed
vector
him.
south.
He could
The weather
feel
looks
it.
clear, but watch for the
There were
Zeros
more
near the
moments
ridge.
now when he
All right,
chose
let's
to
get to it.
disengage. More times he saw a lightning roll inverted and didn't follow. He'd pull back, level off, watch it vanish, and tell himself it was the right call. It usually was. But each time a piece of the old confidence faded. The skies he had once ruled now belonged to men who had learned how to fall faster, dive deeper, and climb back up to finish the fight. And all it had taken was a single pilot, somewhere, once, rolling his plane upside down when he had nothing left to lose. In war, some victories are too quiet. Some heroes never hear the applause. By March of 1944, the inverted dive had saved dozens, maybe hundreds, of American pilots. It had shifted the balance in the skies over the Pacific, turned rookies into survivors, and made the once untouchable Zero vulnerable. But the man who had first made it more than an accident wouldn't live to see the full impact of what he helped create. Major Thomas J. Lynch wasn't the loudest man in the squadron. He wasn't a braggart or a headline chaser. He flew with a quiet intensity, a seriousness that his men respected. He led not from rank, but from reputation. A veteran of the early days, of the worst days, Lynch had survived the chaos of Guadalcanal, the brutal grind of New Guinea, the ambushes, the exhaustion, the funerals. And in those fires, he had become something more than a pilot. He had become a tactician. When Lynch first rolled inverted and pushed into a dive to escape the Zeros above the Russell Islands, it wasn't out of theory, it was instinct, desperation. He didn't know it would work. He only knew that doing what he was supposed to do wasn't working. The maneuver worked. And then it worked again, and again. Soon, younger pilots were trying it. Word spread, the legend grew, and Lynch didn't take credit. He didn't need to. He saw his men coming home day after day. That was enough. On March 8, 1944, Thomas Lynch climbed into the cockpit of his P-38 for what would be his final mission. It was a ground attack sortie, low and fast over Japanese positions in the Philippines. He wasn't chasing Zeros back then. He was chasing supply trucks, communications lines, anything that could help push the Japanese back another mile. He made his first pass cleanly, strafed the target, pulled up, then he circled around for another run. The second pass is always the most dangerous. By then, the enemy knows you're coming. Their gunners are ready. Anti-aircraft fire laced the sky. One burst found him. His plane caught fire. Witnesses said it wobbled, climbed briefly, then nosed over and plunged into the jungle. There was no parachute, no radio call, just smoke. Thomas Lynch was 27 years old. His body was never recovered. Back at the airfield, the squadron waited longer than usual before calling it. Hope lingers sometimes when it shouldn't. They wrote his name on the board, and then they underlined it. A week later, a new pilot asked another, "Who taught you that split-ass escape?" The veteran answered, "Lynch." And then he looked away, silent. He wasn't the only one. 4 months later, halfway around the world, another name was being whispered in reverence. Richard Bong. By summer 1944, Bong was a legend. With 40 confirmed kills, he was America's top ace. A boy from Wisconsin who flew like he was born in the clouds. He didn't have Lynch's solemn edge, but he had something else. A kind of unshakable calm. A presence. He flew with grace. But even legends get grounded. High Command, worried about losing him, pulled Bong from combat in 1945. They sent him stateside. Put him on war bond tours, interviews, public appearances. They called him a hero. Gave him a Medal of Honor. He smiled, said all the right things. But he wasn't built for parades. He wanted to fly. So when the Army offered him a new assignment, testing the cutting-edge Lockheed P-38 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, he didn't hesitate. Speed, innovation, the future. It made sense. On August 6, 1945, Richard Bong took off from a California airfield in a P-80 for a routine acceptance flight. He never came back. Just after takeoff, the engine flamed out. The plane banked hard, nose low. Bong ejected, but too low, too late. The parachute never deployed. He was 24 years old, The news hit the front page of every paper in America, except one. That same morning, half a world away,
We cross the target at
the
0800,
first
then follow
atomic
this
bomb
vector south.
had been
The
dropped
weather
on
looks clear,
Hiroshima.
but watch for the zeros near the ridge.
The end of the war
All right, let's get to it.
had begun. Bong's death was buried beneath headlines of radioactive clouds and geopolitical shockwaves. But among pilots, among the men who knew his name long before it appeared in print, his death was felt like a gut punch. They didn't just lose a hero. They lost a brother, a symbol. The tactic these men helped pioneer, the inverted dive, the split S, the energy escape, was now being taught in classrooms, written into manuals, diagrammed on chalkboards. It had gone from accident to gospel. It had outlived its creator. That's how war works. Some men win battles, others win them, never get to celebrate. Lynch died doing what he taught others to do. Fly aggressively, press the attack. Never give the enemy time to breathe. Bong died chasing the next horizon, trying to master the next machine. They both died flying. And in a strange, quiet way, their deaths closed the loop. The war they had helped to shape was coming to an end, pilots they had never met, names they'd never know, were using their tactics to survive, and live, and return home. That, perhaps, is the most profound legacy a soldier can leave behind. Not just medals, not just stories, but lives saved. It wasn't bravery alone that saved the American pilots. It was physics. War in the skies is governed by invisible laws, forces that don't care about courage or nationality or pride. Gravity pulls, inertia resists, air flows, engines strain. And when the difference between life and death is measured in seconds, those forces become everything. The Zero had ruled the early Pacific because it was built for agility. It was light, so light, in fact, that a strong man could lift one wing by himself. Its designers, led by Jiro Horikoshi, had pursued performance at any cost. They stripped away armor, skipped self-sealing fuel tanks, designed with tight tolerances and feather-light construction. The result was a turning machine, turning. The Zero could make a full 360-degree turn in under 16 seconds. American fighters, like the P-40 Warhawk or the F-4F Wildcat, could take 20 seconds or more. And in a turning fight, that meant death. But turn radius isn't the only measure of a fighter. Not when the rules change. The moment American pilots stopped trying to outturn the Zero and started using energy instead of angles, the battle entered a new domain, a place ruled not by nimbleness, but by velocity, G-forces, and structural integrity. Here's how it works. When a pilot rolls inverted and pushes forward into a dive, something strange happens to his body and his machine. Instead of positive G-force pushing him into the seat, negative G's pull him upward, away from the harness. Loose objects rise. Blood rushes to the brain. Vision reddens. The sensation is jarring, disorienting. Most pilots were trained to endure high positive Gs, 3, 4, even 6, but negative Gs, that was different. 2 Gs downward and you grunt. 2 Gs upward and you might black out. But the human body, with enough training and willpower, can recover. A carbureted engine cannot. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine used a float-type carburetor designed to operate under gravity-fed fuel flow. It
We
worked
cross the
beautifully
target at
during
0800,
normal
then
flight.
follow this vector south.
Climb,
The weather looks
dive,
clear,
turn.
but watch for the zeros near the ridge.
But the moment
All right,
the
let's get to it.
aircraft went inverted or experienced sustained negative Gs, fuel sloshed away from the intake. The engine choked. It lost power. Sometimes it stalled completely. It wasn't the pilot giving up. It was the machine. It wasn't fear. It was fuel starvation. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. Not in midair. not in the heat of the dive. Now consider the P-38 Lightning, two massive Allison V-17-10 engines, each equipped with mechanical fuel injection. That system didn't rely on gravity. It could feed fuel at any angle, right side up, upside down, vertical, or sideways. So when an American pilot dove inverted, his plane kept running, smooth, relentless, and when he came out of the dive, he had all the energy in the world to use. That's where energy maneuvering begins. In aerial combat, energy doesn't just mean fuel or speed, it's altitude, momentum, the ability to trade height for velocity, and velocity back into altitude. A skilled pilot manages his energy like a bank account, spending it when needed,
We cross
saving
the
it
target
when
at
possible.
0800, then follow this vector
The inverted
south.
dive.
The weather
was
looks
a
clear, but
master
watch for the
stroke of
zeros near
energy
the ridge.
maneuvering.
All right, let's get to it.
Let's walk through a typical scenario. A zero sits on the tail of a P-38. The American pilot can't turn tighter. He can't outclimb. He's in trouble. But instead of trying to escape horizontally, he rolls inverted and dives. Immediately, gravity helps. His nose drops fast. He doesn't pull the stick back, he pushes forward. The negative G's hit. His body screams. The altimeter spins. The zero follows, or tries to. But when the Japanese pilot rolls inverted and pushes into the dive, everything starts to break down. His controls soften, his fuel system hiccups. His engine may even stall. Even if it doesn't, the airframe begins to twist. The Zero wasn't designed for high-speed dives. Its control surfaces flutter. Its wings flex. If the pilot pushes too hard, the structure begins to come apart. And so he lets go. He levels out. He watches the P-38 vanish. At 12,000 feet, the American pilot rolls right side up. His airspeed is peaking. Now he's loaded with energy, more than enough to pull into a zoom climb. He pulls back, gains altitude, regains the advantage. Now he's above the zero. Now he's the one in control. And the battle has turned. Zorkan did the split. Essentially the same maneuver done deliberately from altitude became the formal name. It was taught later in manuals. But in the Pacific in 1943, it was simply survival. American planes were built tougher, heavier, more rugged. They could dive fast, very fast. The P-47 Thunderbolt was so heavy that when it dove, it approached the speed of sound. Control surfaces compressed. Instruments froze, but it held together. The Corsair, with its huge radial engine, could slice through the air like a bomb. And the P-38, with its twin boom structure and twin engines, became a master of the sky not by turning tighter, but by falling faster and rising harder. It's easy to forget now in the age of computer-guided missiles and supersonic thrust how much raw physics ruled air combat in World War II. But back then, the edge belonged to those who understood gravity, who knew when to dive, when to climb, when to roll upside down and disappear. The Zero was a magnificent machine, but it was a machine with limits. It couldn't break the laws of physics. And when American pilots finally stopped fighting the Zero on its terms and started using the sky the way it really worked, the war in the air began to shift. Not because their planes were perfect, but because they knew how to fly them perfectly in the moments that mattered most. The war ended. The planes were mothballed. The heroes came home, those who could. And yet, the sky remembered. Long after the P-38s were grounded, long after the last Zero disappeared into a museum hangar, the lessons learned above the Solomon Islands continued to echo through the clouds. Because what Richard Bong and Thomas Lynch had discovered wasn't just a trick, it was a principle. Don't fight the enemy where they're strongest. Use the sky, use your speed, and use the laws of physics to your advantage. That lesson, passed down from pilot to pilot in tents and flight briefings, became part of modern air combat doctrine. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, American pilots found themselves again in the skies, this time facing Soviet-built MiG-15s over the frozen mountains of North Korea. Those MiGs were fast, agile, climbed like rockets. In many ways, they were the spiritual successors to the Zero. And once again, American pilots turned to energy tactics, split S maneuvers, dive and zoom, boom and run. Not turning fights, but thinking fights. The ghosts of the Pacific still whispered in their ears. In Vietnam, the pattern repeated. American jets like the F-4 Phantom faced the nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s in brutal dogfights. And again, the doctrine proved true. Turning inside the enemy could be a death sentence, but controlling the engagement, choosing when to fight, when to run, when to roll, inverted, and disappear, saved lives. By 1969,
We
the
crossed
U.S.
the
Navy had
target at
seen enough
0800,
pilots
then
die
follow this
trying to
vector south.
out-dogfight their
The weather
opponents.
looks clear, but watch for
They
the
launched
zeros
an
near the
elite
ridge.
training program
All right,
at
let's get to
Miramar
it.
Naval Air Station, San Diego. Its name? The United States Navy Fighter Weapons School. You know it as Top Gun. And its core philosophy? The same principle discovered by a desperate P-38 pilot in 1943. Know your aircraft, know your enemy. Never fight on his terms. In Top Gun classrooms, instructors drilled students, not just on missiles and tactics, but on physics, angle of attack, energy conservation, G-forces, situational awareness. And always the split S maneuver remained in the curriculum. Not because it was flashy, but because it worked. Today, young pilots in F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightnings still learn the fundamentals of energy maneuvering. They use fly-by-wire controls, helmet-mounted sights, but when they dive away from a threat and use gravity to build speed for the kill, they are, in essence, flying alongside Richard Bong. Technology changes, but physics doesn't. And maybe that's the real legacy. That in the deadliest sky imaginable, when all seemed lost,
We crossed the
survival
target at
didn't come from a
0800, then
better
follow this
machine.
vector south.
It
The
came
weather
from
looks clear, but
understanding
watch
the
for the
sky,
zeros near the ridge.
All right,
from
let's get
trusting
to it.
instinct, from ignoring the manual when it didn't work, from doing the impossible, rolling inverted and diving into the unknown, and living to tell the story. If you ever find yourself near Colorado Springs, visit the National Museum of World War II Aviation. Walk past the Corsairs, the Mustangs, the P-47s, and when you stand in front of the P-38 Lightning painted Marge, with Bong's name stenciled on the canopy, take a moment. Close your eyes. Imagine the sound of twin engines screaming in a vertical dive. Imagine the red haze of G-forces. Imagine doing something that every instructor said would kill you, and then imagine pulling up alive because you trusted your plane, because you trusted the sky. That's not just history, that's legacy. That's